Hello, I'm Lorie Karnath, editor of Molecular Frontiers Journal magazine. I'm here today with wildlife veterinarian and epidemiologist Sharon Deem, who heads the St. Louis Zoo Institute for Conservation Medicine, and wildlife veterinarian Brenn-White, who is also with the Institute. They have recently co-authored an article for the current issue of Molecular Frontiers Journal on One Health, the key to preventing COVID-19 from becoming the new normal. Welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Thank you. Let's talk a little bit about the article and the premise of One Health. From, as you describe, has to do with an interdisciplinary approach to planetary health. Sharon, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. First of all, we are so excited to be speaking with folks today about this topic. One Health, if you're not familiar with it, is really a movement that has gained a lot of steam over the last decade or two. And it's this understanding of how interconnected the health of all life is. So the health of human and non-human animals and plants and the environments we're all dependent on. And more importantly, how all our different disciplines need to be working together to overcome the challenges, such as a pandemic, but the health challenges that are facing all of us. And that's truly what the One Health movement is about today.
Okay, thank you. Is Maris, you also are working with Sharon on this?
Yes, yeah, and thank you for having me here as well. I'm excited to be here, as Sharon said. So I have a background in One Health as well, and I'm working with the Institute really on research at that intersection that Sharon mentioned. So we look at health and disease where animals, humans, and environmental factors overlap, and how each of those three aspects of what we call the One Health triad, so animals, humans, and environment, how each of those three aspects influence the health of those other aspects.
All right, let's talk about the article. You start out the article by saying that the year 2020 will be remembered in the coming decades as the year where we made the changes demanded by the moment, or the year where humans failed to change our overconsumptive course with nature. And COVID-19 was soon forgotten as just another in a long list of coming pandemics. So, what do you think brought us to this point, and what do you believe represents the best path going forward?
I can kick it off. So a couple thoughts on this one. I think, and again, we go over it, I feel fairly well in the article, just looking at where we are with 7.8 billion of us, and how do we safely feed one species, the human species, with 7.8 billion of us on a finite planet, with the billions and billions of livestock species that are alive today, that we are continually slaughtering for a food for our one species. And then when you mix into that the legal and illegal use of non-domestic or wildlife species as food sources, we really see this overconsumptive use of animal protein. And that's just one piece of it, right? That's just for food to keep the human population going. So I think we're really, we need to be thinking about, is this pandemic, none of us sitting here should be surprised of this pandemic, right? Scientists, conservationists have been talking about things like this for decades, and we've experienced similar things, two of them being coronaviruses, right? So SARS and MERS, the last two coronaviruses. So we should be more prepared for thinking about how these types of pandemics can and do occur.
Okay, so that brings me to the next question, where you mention again in the article that the drivers of zoonotic EIDs are most universally caused by humans' actions. And I'll ask both of you, can you explain what you mean by this?
Yeah, I was going to say, I'll go ahead and start off. I'm sure Sharon will have lots to add. But what I was about to say actually at the end of Sharon's last comments ties in really nicely with this, which is I think it's really important for us to remember when we're talking about these big zoonotic pandemics. So zoonotic diseases are diseases that go back and forth between humans and non-human animals. And when we talk about those, it's really easy to think about all of these diseases that are in wild animals or are in domestic animals like dogs or livestock and see those as the source of the problem. And what we really tried to carefully articulate in this article is that the source of the problem isn't the fact that these diseases are out there in the wild or in our food animals. It is the changes in the way we interact with our world that are causing these diseases not only to become a risk to people, but to spread dramatically on a global scale when they do spill over into people. So sort of the four dynamics of that we mentioned in the article, and there are more, are spillover events. So when Sharon was talking about wet markets and these places where we bring wild animals into contact with humans and potentially domestic animals, it provides a really unique opportunity for a virus to interact with a species that it's never encountered before. And that can cause the virus to mutate, it can cause it to reassort, and it can cause it to jump hosts. So it can jump from a pangolin, let's say, to a human, or a bat to a human. And that bringing together of the animals is actually what's causing the risk. It's not the bat out there in the forest by itself. So the three other main factors that we talk about are biodiversity loss. So again, actually the loss of species can increase human risk, and habitat loss. So when we destroy the loss of habitat for wild animals, we create greater contact with them. Just like that wet market, if we go and we destroy a patch of forest, those animals have to come into human habitation to find new food and new places to live. So we're creating new contact with them. And the last dimension that we talk about is climate change. So I won't go into each one of those in particular, but I think that really points out the main point that these are all human-driven environmental changes and sociological and economic changes versus something inherently biological about a bat or a pangolin.
Okay, so Sharon, if you don't mind, and maybe you have some comments to that, but also I do think we should talk about how climate change is linked to this, and as well as to future outbreaks of disease, because a lot of people still do not equate climate change with this pandemic. So perhaps you have some comments to make.
Sure. One comment I want to say is I hope you captured everything Maris just said. That was beautiful. I mean, really, you summed up the article, you summed up our issues today, the four whammies we talk about. So I thought that was really fantastic. In terms of, planetary changes and those four that we're talking about, particularly in the article itself, they all mix and match and intersect these various issues. That said, climate change wouldn't be the one that jumps to my mind with this particular pandemic, right? I mean, I think what comes to my mind is more that spillover event and what then occurs in terms of this changed global world and all the positives of a global society from a human perspective, but also then if you're a virus, how wonderful that is for the ability to move around the globe, right? So travel and trade and the actual movement of those viruses once, for example, in this case, this pathogen that reassorted, as Maris was saying, and has spilled into the human host and became an incredibly human adapted. And then we humans, as we're moving and spreading and doing our 21st century lives, help the virus with its movement. And I think that's really part of that social and cultural and thinking about it, not just as Maris beautifully said, not that bat sitting in a forest somewhere, but how that bat sitting in a forest has its life history has totally been changed because of humans, and then the ability for these things to move around the planet.
I guess we could say certainly the way the world has opened up and become a much more global trade and other travel, etc., place that we live in is certainly true. But I think a lot of these wet markets and so have existed for thousands of years even. But if we go back to that concept, you know, we're all in the same world. So how do we live alongside the natural world these days without encouraging additional disease activities?
That's a very large question. I can take a stab at starting with it. So to take one quick little step back. So as you mentioned, Lorie, there have been wet markets or live animal markets for centuries in all of these places. And what has changed is the scale at which these things are occurring and the geographical, both sort of the number of animals, the number of people coming together, and also the geographic spread of these things. So the distance with which we are bringing animals into city centers and expanding out into the wild. And that really relates to what Sharon just said about globalization as well. Zoonotic spillovers have these sorts of large zoonotic spillover events have likely been going on for centuries as well, but they used to be isolated to small communities. But since we are all so connected now, an outbreak in one location rapidly spreads. And I think that also provides an opportunity to address something on a global scale. So when we are all interconnected, we have the opportunity to develop holistic, comprehensive approaches. And things like the OIE and the WHO, so the organizations that are responsible on a global scale for wildlife health, animal health, and human health, have come together in support of a One Health approach. So they've created their own One Health tripartite to work together in all three aspects of the One Health triad to promote surveillance so that we can identify diseases as they come up. And really importantly, identifying these risk factors and, you know, what we call in the article drivers of zoonotic spillover or zoonotic pandemics. And identifying those drivers is sort of step one. So we have them on this really big scale right now that we talked about in the article, which is land use change and biodiversity loss and bringing together species that used to be disparate, and of course, climate change. But we need to localize those solutions and look within individual communities to find actual on-the-ground solutions. So it's a really complicated answer whether or not you, for instance, want to ban the farming and consumption of all animals that are not things that we consider livestock, so that we would consider wildlife in this country, but maybe are considered a food animal in another country. That's a very American or Eurocentric approach that might have some really big problems in terms of food security for people in other places. So coming up with ways by working with local communities to solve these problems is going to be the long-term answer. But I think we're in a lot of ways just at the beginning of figuring out what those answers are. I will say one of the sort of low-hanging fruits of this is stopping illegal wildlife trade. It's a really sort of high bang for your buck activity. So we know that wildlife trade increases the probability of spillover wherever it happens. And so where that is already illegal and is not in the best interest either of conservation or human health or human food security, we can do something right now about those things. And simultaneously looking at ways to help people with other livelihoods if that's something that they need. So really long, big answer, which is why we need many, many disciplines to actually tackle these problems, because there's so many different dynamics at play. I don't know if Sharon, if you have a more concise or positive answer for that.
Yeah, it sounds like it's very complex beyond obviously the realm of science, where you're going to need to involve governments and field researchers and people who understand changes to landscape and architecture and everything else. I mean, it's a global problem that we've been dealing with on many levels forever. I think the stakes have, as we see now, have gotten a lot higher. So what would you say, perhaps, because it's such a massive coordination problem and logistical problem, and even the idea of stopping illegal wildlife trade, I mean, certainly that is something that many people have been involved in and tried to do for also a very long time. But why don't we take it first from in terms of the scientific community? What do you think in particular the important steps that the scientific community can be taking right now to lead us in the right direction?
So a few thoughts come to mind, and first, I do want to say one of the positives today. There are a few positive things that have come out of this pandemic, right? One of them is that we're having this conversation, and not just us. I mean, people around the planet are having this conversation. In this case, about zoonoses, about pandemics, about wildlife trade. And that's really positive, because that is bringing people together to really think about how things have changed from the time the first wet market sprung up thousands of years ago, right? When there were just a few people on the planet. You know, we now have this different world. And so here we are in COVID-19, the year of the pandemic, and we are talking about it. So that's positive. And science is talking about it. So scientists from, like you said, Lorie, all those different disciplines of scientific people, from the public health, human side, the veterinary side, the ecology side, that is One Health, right? Bringing all those disciplines together. But also the beauty of One Health is, again, like you just said, Lorie, we need the economists and the anthropologists and the politicians and the sociologists and all the other ologists, right? From science to social to political, the players, to really think about these huge global challenges and all come together. And that's happening. You know, it didn't happen when MERS showed up in 2012. It didn't happen when SARS showed up in 2003, but it's happening today. And that's, you know, that's positive.
Okay, I agree. Certainly it's positive and necessary. So we've spoken a little bit now about how the scientific community might react. How should everyday citizens behave and plan for the next pandemic, or how to avoid the next pandemic? How should they be helping? Because it's not just the scientists. They obviously, this is too large a task. So if you don't mind, Sharon, I'll start with you, and then we can ask Maris as well.
And that is such a good question, because this is all of us, right? There's 7.8 billion of us, and we all have a responsibility. And what I would put back to whoever is listening to this, the individual person, it's up to us to decide what we're going to purchase to put on our dinner table, what we're going to purchase to have in our house, how we're going to interact with climate change producing emissions, such as, you know, how we travel, how much livestock we eat with the methane they produce. So, you know, I truly am a believer in the power of one. And so a government's not going to save us, right? It is those individual actions, and they're considered One Health actions. And so I think that really, again, putting the positive think on this, people are, my neighbor knows what here in the central part of the United States now knows what a wet market is, now understands about zoonoses. This is being discussed, and then you think about, well, what is my role in these problems, and pick your favorite challenge today and say, oh, maybe if I'm a meat eater, maybe I'll only eat meat once a week and not every day. And maybe I'll make sure that meat comes from a safe, reputable, and humane way of production. So those are individual choices we each make every day that will impact the prevention of the next pandemic.
Okay, thank you. Maris, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Sure, yeah. So two things. So I just want to sort of explicitly say that there's a lot of really excellent research that points to consumption of animal protein having negative effects on the environment, be it climate change, be it land conversion, be it water pollution. And I think a fourth one we can definitely add to that is an increase in zoonotic diseases, because the more we concentrate animals in one location, the more disease spreads, the more we interact with them, the likelier it is that we may get one of their pathogens. So that is on the list of things you can definitely do. And there are a whole host of cultural and nutritional reasons why that may or may not be appropriate for given people, but it is something that should be on that list as an evidence-based action you can take, is reducing your animal protein consumption. And the other thing, so Sharon did an excellent job of detailing individual actions you can take. And I just want to encourage people to redirect that back at our political system and policymakers, and to engage with people who are making these decisions on a really large scale that have the potential for global impact. So if that means direct advocacy work, great. If that means going out and voting, if you are in a country where that is an option you have, then please do it. Because getting science and evidence-based policy around these things is one of our biggest challenges. And to the extent that we have a voice, we should make our voices heard.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. I think one of the problems with the issues that you outlined is that to make some of these changes will require a huge technological aspect and component, just in terms of monitoring and identifying effects. For example, if everyone stopped eating meat tomorrow, you'd have a lot of cattle farmers who would be out of business. You'd have land that suddenly is being used in another capacity. There's so many different factors that need to be evaluated. And a lot of this, and even your suggestion that we make sure that we eat safely, a lot of this will be monitored and measured by technology, which also has an impact. So all of these things have to be put in a balance, and it requires just so much coordination. And I think that maybe is part of it when we ask ourselves, what can we do? Is that we think of ways that we can coordinate these different types of information in constructive ways. I personally have spent a lot of time in the field in some of these local villages you talk about, and have experienced many wet markets and how these people live, etc. And there, for each thing that you might, as you suggested, take away, there's going to have to be something that's given back. And if you think about it at those levels, it's really a massive undertaking. And but it's a direction that we have to go. And we have learned a lot, and our knowledge has evolved quite a bit during this pandemic. So one of the questions I had for you is, how do we put this knowledge to best use? I'll ask both of you the question. So Maris, why don't you start?
Sure. So I am I'm realizing through the course of this conversation that I have optimism about global institutions that I didn't fully recognize. So for me, and this goes back to your question, Lorie, about what can the scientific community do in this situation? And I think as scientists, performing research as a One Health team, so considering the different aspects that you just brought up that are so important, which is, what are the social and economic pressures on these people when we change this system? How is their behavior going to change when we ask them not to hunt for bushmeat, and what effects is that going to have? Bringing all of those voices or threads into a model is really valuable, and there are more and more people doing that. And for me, then the next best thing to do is to make that actionable. So bring that to your World Health Organization, you bring it to the FAO and the OIE, you bring it to your local government, and advocate for policy change. The sort of flip side and equally important aspect of that would be acting very, very locally, because your solution in your own community is going to be incredibly different. Here in my neighborhood in St. Louis, the ways we contribute to a spread of a zoonotic pandemic is completely different than the communities that we work in Madagascar or Kenya. And I can be equally active in using those same evidence-based solutions in my own community. So here, honestly, mostly what that looks like is wearing masks and washing your hands and just getting us all to participate in that. But ultimately, engaging also in those actions that Sharon mentioned that stop these larger drivers that we're all participating in.
Thank you. Sharon, do you have something to add to that?
Actually, not really. I think how Maris covered it was great. One point, though, I think is really the crux of this whole discussion potentially, and you pointed it out. These are huge issues, and you change one thing and it's tied to another that's tied to another, and these are not easy things that on a Friday night we're gonna come up with the answer and go have our glass of wine, right? These are big global challenges, and that's what One Health is about. And we mentioned it in the article. Many people think we live in the age of the Anthropocene. So humans are the drivers of changes on Earth today. That is why the One Health movement came to be about 20 years ago, right? That we realize these huge global interconnected challenges, and you can't just change a switch and the answers are there. That's why it takes this multidisciplinary approach to look at it from all the angles of what it means for the people, the planet, the animals that are part of the mix. And so I think, again, COVID, if it's done anything positive for the world, it has totally made people understand that at a level they might not have a year ago. And so that's really positive.
I agree. And I'm very appreciative of what you are doing with your One Health movement. And I think everybody's going to want to know, how do they help? And I think you delineated some of that. And I think just the fact that people will be much more conscientious and conscious of what's happening around them is already a big first positive step.
I think if there's one take-home point I would love to have people get out of sort of our piece and this pandemic in terms of their personal actions and what they can do is the understanding that the way you treat the environment or how your actions impact the environment directly impacts your own health. It will circle back around and will have a personal impact on you or members of your family. And to me, that's the piece of the puzzle that I think has been very theoretical for most of us, or many of us, but is really tangible right now. And that I think just really living in that concept helps you understand subsequent actions you could take.
I agree with you. I also think, and we spoke a little bit about this earlier on, is that when we were talking about how do humans as part of this planet live alongside and with nature. And I think that that's part of it, is that many of us have not. Many of us have grown up in cities. These are the first generations to have truly grown up in cities, whereas prior to that, people did not. It's only the last, maybe 70 years or so that you've had really big cities that many people have lived in. So I think if we can have a bigger and better and more interactive understanding with nature, that we may respect it and treat it in a way and interact with it in a way that does not lead us to the place where we seem to be heading right now. You can let me know if you agree with that or not, but I do think it partially has to do with many people not so active with nature.
Sharon, do you want to talk about the human health benefits studies at all?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah,
So yeah, I'd be happy to. I think, Lorie, you're right on. And one of the things that we in the One Health community and many other communities, but one of the things we talk about is, the reason there's 7.8 billion of us is because of nature and biodiversity and the free resources that humans have had since the beginning of time, right? And those resources on a finite planet, as our population, carrying capacity expands, resources are coming down, this concept of ecosystem services and what they provide for human health is really something that if folks listening aren't familiar with, they should look into, because that is part of that. We need nature. Whether you live on a 100-floor high-rise in Singapore, you need nature as much as the next person, right? Nature is why we have been so successful as a species. And that's hard to really connect with people today. What Maris was mentioning is we've done over the last few years, we've done a couple, what I think are really cool studies looking at how animals in nature actually provides physical and psychological benefits to a human, right? So from both psychological, meaning they're happier, less tense, more energized with their interaction with nature. And they even have better parameters with the stress hormone, right? Cortisol as stress hormone we have, as well as blood pressure. So these are positive physical things with your interaction with nature. And that, again, many of us live in an urbanized area. 55% of us on the planet today live in a city. But that connection with nature is actually part of the positive impacts or positive benefits for human health.
Thank you. I agree. Let me ask you this. In the article, you say that this time we got lucky. And what would it mean if we had not been lucky, as you describe it?
May I take this from you?
Sure.
Yeah.
Because hearing it said out loud, it is hard for us to feel lucky if we are one of the families, the over 1 million people who have lost somebody, right? Or the millions of people who have experienced hardship, physical hardship from being sick with COVID or lost a job. So lucky, it sounds wrong, and that's not what we meant in any way. I mean, this is a tragedy on so many levels. What we were saying in that paragraph really was, if we had this SARS-CoV-2, as transmissible as it is from human to human to human, and if it had the mortality rate of the Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome, the other coronavirus, at 30% instead of less than 1%, this would be a different discussion today. So I'm careful about that word lucky.
This could have been a lot worse. And it may become a lot worse if we don't take some of the steps that you're discussing. And so I think that your article overall was a very positive piece and starts to show us a pathway which is what a lot of us are looking for. And I also think that it shows how important science and other disciplines are towards working towards this goal that you're setting for us, and telling us what, you know, maybe was common knowledge in the earlier centuries, that nature is an important aspect of being human, and we are going to rely on nature. And how do we do it safely and productively so that we don't experience this kind of plague that we are today? So it's because of work and articles like yours that we are seeing some direction. So my point in bringing up what you mentioned in the article was to say thank you, and that is something that we should be aware of. And maybe we could end by both of you just talking a little bit about what we should be thinking going forward. How do we create the best path? And we've spoken a little bit about it, but you know, what is the positive path ahead?
Sharon, do you want me to start, and you can wrap us up, take us out?
Oh, great. Take us out.
So first of all, Lorie, that's fantastic to hear. That's just to hear the effect or your perception of the article and the effect that it had on you. It's definitely it's a call to action and a proposal of an approach, and it is intended to be both cautionary and hopeful. So it sounds like we got that in there. So in terms of steps forward, I think I'm going to go back to just a couple of things I said before. I think most of us know a lot of ways that our personal actions affect the environment. And that can be driving your car, that can be eating meat, that can be plastic pollution, all kinds of things. And if you just take a moment to really let it sink in that the way we treat the environment is how we got in the situation we're in right now. It's why we're having all of these conversations over Zoom. It's why many of us can't go to our workplaces or see loved ones. That's gonna generate its own action. And I think as a scientific community, finding partners across disciplines, creating those One Health bridges and connections is going to be the way forward in terms of studying these diseases and in terms of helping find real world solutions that take into consideration real needs that people have in a way that allows them to live with nature, with respect, and with sustainability, and create resilient systems that are going to both prevent pandemics, but also just sustain life for all of us.
Okay, I agree. Thank you. Sharon, do you have something to add to that?
So what she said, but I'll add just two other closing thoughts. Totally what Maris just said, but two things that I feel positive about. One actually is just a statement that I don't think we touched upon in this whole conversation. And one of the things that I would caution all of us to not do, to not reach for, is thinking of wildlife or animals as the bad guys, right? We're having these spillover events, and that's why we explain it in the commentary and tonight, talking about how that spillover happens. It's not like the wildlife want to make us sick, right? So I think we need to be very careful to not reach for those measures that do more harm than good by saying, let's call wildlife because they have this particular virus. And that's happened over the last few decades, where inappropriately thousands and thousands of wildlife individuals are culled or killed to stop infection from going to humans. That is not the answer for all those reasons we've described. It's the human connection that we have to be changing. So just to reiterate that wildlife are not the bad guys. But the last thing that, again, I think is incredibly positive, we here in Missouri, we teach a One Health course, right? A semester-long university course on this concept, this movement of One Health for the next generation of One Health practitioners. And these young people are going to be all kind of professionals, from medical doctors to artists and everything in between. And they get it. They understand the need for working together. They understand that their planet has a lot of health challenges that will face their future and their today. And those folks are learning how this One Health approach really will help to come up with the solutions for these challenges. And I think that's incredibly positive. These One Health courses are springing up across the globe, around the world. If people are interested in it, please contact Maris and I. We are happy to share what we know about getting these courses up and running.
Thank you. It's a very good point. I appreciate it, and I appreciate the work that you're doing. I know many others do. So I'd like to thank you both for being here today. And I'd also like to thank the World Scientific team and the Molecular Frontiers Journal team. So thank you, and we look forward to hearing a lot more from you.
Thank you.
Thank you.